Ralph 124C41 Plus, Chapter 13. Alice, on being aroused to consciousness by the ministrations of Lilette, the maid, and Fernand, and finding herself a prisoner on board a space flyer at the mercy of the latter, was overwhelmed with fury. This cool abduction of herself provoked her to such a passionate outburst that Fernand had actually retreated before it. "You coward!" she blazed. "How dare you keep me here? Turn around and take me back at once. At once, do you hear?" Fernand, in the act of opening her door and going back to his lab, pauses, smiling. "My dear girl," he says mockingly, "ask of me anything and I will grant it, except that. You have a temper that delights me. Your smiles will be all the sweeter later." Her answer was to fly at him with such passion that he involuntarily took a step backwards. In a flash she had run by him, was down the stairs, and tugging at the fastenings of the door that led outward. Fernand bounded after her, calling to Lilette as he ran, and in a moment they were both struggling with the girl, who had indeed become a veritable wildcat. She had both hands fastened around the great bar that held the door, and fought madly to unfasten it. Let that door be opened the fraction of an inch, and all three would instantly have been blown to pieces. Fernand wrenched at her hands in real fear that she would succeed in her purpose, which was evidently their destruction. She was a strong, athletic girl, and at the moment her desperation gave her added vigor. But the combined strength and by no means gentle handling of Fernand and Lilette, who herself was a large and powerfully built woman, forced Alice to relinquish her hold, and she was dragged, struggling, back to her room, and left there with the door double locked. Alone, she passed from the high exaltation of anger to a state of nervous apprehension. Another woman in her place might have wept, have begged piteously for mercy where there was no mercy, but this girl was made of sterner stuff. She might be frightened, but Fernand should never guess it. Dry-eyed, with lips set in a firm line, lest they tremble and betray her, she sits facing the door, gripping in her small hands the only weapon she has been able to find, a small metal vase having a round and fairly thick base. Knowing that Fernand will come back, prepared as she is for his return, she is unable to repress a start of genuine terror when she hears someone unbolting the door. She clutches the vase more tightly, white-faced but courageous. Fernand enters alone, carefully choosing the door behind him. He wears a customary rather bland smile, and his voice is all suave to the point of oiliness. "All over our little fit of temper?" he asks. Alice stares at him disdainfully, unanswering. Then her eyes fall upon something in his hand, manacles of glistening stelonium. The horror she feels is depicted in her face, for he says, holding them out for her to see, "A pair of bracelets for you, sweetheart. Just as a precautionary measure. You are rather too quick with those hands of yours, but I am not unkind, my dear. You need not wear them if you will only give me your word not to repeat your recent performance." Beyond the door she sees Lilette standing in readiness, and she knows the physical resistance will be ineffectual. Far better to give her promise and be free than to be bound and helpless. Besides, there is the lab, and in it there are many roads to freedom. There are poisons that kill instantly and painlessly. Unmanacled, she might reach them eventually. Bound, even that way she would be closed. Coldly, clearly, she gives her promise, but inwardly she offers up a prayer of thankfulness when he turns and hands the handcuffs to Lilette. "You can lay down your weapon, Alice," he says, still with a mocking smile. "I can assure you that you have no need of it. You will find me a gentle lover, and one who is willing to wait for his lady's favors." He stops suddenly, and turning his head in the direction of the stairs, listens intently. From the lab comes the insistent ringing of the radio apparatus. With a muttering order to Lilette, he is gone. What was happening, Alice doesn't know. She cannot read radio messages, but she knows that only something of grave importance could have made Ferdinand rush like that to the radio. She strains her ears, but hears nothing. Her hopes rise with a great bound with the thought that perhaps Ralph is on his way to her. Perhaps it was he signaling. She has been sure that he will follow her as soon as possible, and now her dark eyes brighten with hope. At this moment, Lilette, without a glance in her direction, closes the door, and Alice, once more alone and a prisoner behind bolted doors. It is then that she gives way to her loneliness and despair. She knows that if it had been Ralph signaling, Fernand would at once have received the news that the scientist was in pursuit, set about making plans to elude him. She knew that Fernand was desperate, that his life under the law was forfeit for this crime he has committed. He will stop at nothing. Instinctively, she feels that he would destroy her and himself rather than be taken. Certainly, he would not hesitate to murder Ralph if he could. She flings herself upon the couch and bursts into tears of agony and terror. Suddenly she springs to her feet, still sobbing, wide-eyed with dread of what she knows not. The space flyer has stopped, the throb of machinery has stilled, and the flyer is hanging motionless in space. Standing in the middle of the room, rigid with suspense, Alice waits with beating heart. Suddenly she hears the sound of rapid steps on the stairs. Now they halt at the door, and someone fumbles at the bolts and locks. The next instant the door is flung wide open, and Lysanor, the Martian, stands upon the threshold. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, The Terror of the Comet. During the next few days, Ralph passes midway between Earth and Venus. This is the spectacle that at times greatly increases the transport space flyer travel between Earth and Mars, many of the inhabitants of both planets making the long journey simply to get a view of the beautiful planet Venus. Ralph runs almost parallel for a time with the two planets, Venus to his left, his own planet Earth to his right. Although he is quite near the former, he can hardly see it, as the bright rays of the sun preclude detailed observation. A few days later, however, it had swung sufficiently far enough to the left to afford him occasional glimpses of its beauties. Ralph works almost continuously in his lab in the conning tower. In the course of the week since he has left Earth, he has only catnapped for about 2 hours, since sleep is impossible. He constructed several new pieces of apparatus which he considered might be useful in case of a possible encounter with Lysanor. He knows that Lysanor cannot be easily subdued or caught, as Ferdinand, the tall Martian, is an inventor himself and knows much about handling modern death-dealing weapons. It would be useless to try to radio perforer, as he would probably be carrying a Cylonium armor, proof against all radium emanations. One of the first things he has done is to lead wires from the steering apparatus up to the conning tower. On the floor of the tower he arranges contacts in such a manner that he can press them together with his feet. The control is similar to the foot pedals of an organ. He then practices for some days until he can steer the flyer wholly with his feet. Thus his hands are free to control any apparatus he will need for attack or defense. With his feet he can control the machine so as to avoid projectiles if necessary. As the days roll by, however, Ralph becomes more and more disturbed. He now takes observations hourly, his eyes glued to the indicator. With a sinking heart, he sees that he is not gaining on the Martian. The latter has his machine well tuned up and is covering almost 90,000 miles an hour. At this rate, Ralph can never catch up with Lysanor. It is maddening. The days become a long, drawn-out agony. Ralph has done everything in his power to accelerate the speed of his flyer and to strain the machinery further than meant inviting certain death. Within 8 days, Lysanor would land on Mars. His course now plainly showed that he was headed for the planet. At best, Ralph would be 10 hours behind, time enough for the Martian to accomplish his purpose. And he, Ralph 124C41+, the greatest inventor the world had ever produced, was powerless. Again he takes observations, and again the results are the same. A weariness of the spirit sweeps over him. The dark waters of despair seem to inundate his very soul. To have been physically exhausted would have been a relief. To know the blessedness of but an hour's sound sleep, to be free from this terrible tension. He sinks down upon a seat and buries his head in his hands, and as he sits, striving to quiet his worn and troubled mind, there comes to him an idea, nay, more than an idea, an inspiration by which he will overcome the formidable difficulties that beset him. The idea is so simple that when once formulated it seems ridiculous not to have thought of it before this moment. His soul weariness falls from him like a discarded garment. He springs to his feet, once more a scientist and man of action, triumphant, dominant. His marvelous ingenuity sees the way out. His mind will again triumph over time and space. He will achieve the impossible, surmount what is now the insurmountable. The battle is not lost, it had but begun. He knows he cannot overhaul Lysanor, neither can he intercept him. A wireless decoy message was futile. Lysanor would never be caught by such a flimsy trick. But he must do something to prevent Lysanor from reaching Mars. How could it be accomplished? By sending a message to the Martian authorities? A futile thought. Even if the distance could be bridged, which was doubtful, Lysanor would in all likelihood intercept the message with his recorder. He would simply send a message to his friend to board a space flyer and to rush to him at top speed. The marriage ceremony could then be performed out in space. No, Lysanor must not know that he was pursued, and still he must be prevented from landing. Ralph will literally move the heavens. He will threaten Mars with a comet. Lysanor's patriotism could be depended upon to make an effort to divert the comet from its course, to avoid the imminent collision with Mars. This Lysanor could do without danger to himself, simply by steering his fire close to the head of the comet within a few hundred kilometers. The gravitational action of his machine on the comet would deflect the course of the latter enough. Even a few degrees would be sufficient to change the path of the meteor. But where was the comet to come from? To Ralph, this was simplicity itself. He did not need to catch a comet. He would manufacture one for himself, a comet more unique than ever rushed through space. He knew that comets had been reproduced artificially on a small scale centuries ago. However, no one had ever tried to make a real comet. He also knew that the largest comets have a very small mass, and that the tail is composed mainly of gas and dust, which is so thin that Ralph thus becomes the first human being to create a heavenly body. As comets are composed mainly of hydrogen gas and dust, the creating of Ralph's artificial comet is absurdly simple to the scientist. By means of scraps of zinc and iron filings over which sulfuric acid is poured, Ralph produces a great quantity of hydrogen. This he fills in tanks, and when he has generated enough of the gas, he connects the tanks with a large metal stopcock in the wall of the space flyer. As soon as the stopcock is opened, the hydrogen rushes out into the open with a roar. Immediately, Ralph connects his high-frequency apparatus with the outside aerials of the space flyer, and the expected phenomenon takes place. The hydrogen particles, which heretofore had been invisible, begin to glow with a wonderful light, enveloping the entire flyer. For thousands of miles behind the machine stretches a true comet's tail, the flyer forming its head or nucleus. The tail, as in all comets, is turned away from the sun, and although Ralph cannot see the end of the tail, he knows that what he has created could be seen for hundreds of thousands of miles like any natural comet. Ralph, however, is not fully satisfied, and he therefore starts to improve the comet. He manufactures several other gases in large quantities, which he ejects into space, greatly enhancing the brilliancy and size of the comet's head as well as of its tail. The head, however, he thinks is not solid enough as yet, and so he sets about correcting this defect. Comets are composed chiefly of gases, but contain a large amount of dust. The dust particles act very much like the dust particles upon which a sun's rays fall, and it is these particles which create the comet's appearance. If the atmosphere is eliminated and the same dust placed in outer space, a small comet will result. The small particles will be highly electrified by the sun and begin to glow. Each particle repels the other, and thus even a handful of light dust will form a respectable comet in space. Ralph makes his dust by grinding paper and wood and other materials on a fine carborundum wheel. After he has made a few pails full, he blows the dust out into space, and if his comet had been a magnificent sight before, it was really awe-inspiring to look upon now from a great distance. The heavier particles cling close to the flyer on account of gravitational action, but completely envelop it. The machine is now a true planet, while the fine dust particles have become little satellites revolving around their central body, the flyer. The lighter dust particles find their way into the tail as the powerful pressure of the sun's light overcomes the attraction which the flyer brings upon them. Ralph turns off the high-frequency current, and yet the comet is not extinguished, and its brilliance is not in the least dimmed. The gas and dust particles have no way to dissipate their initial electrical charge, being in an absolute vacuum, and Ralph's artificial comet has become a real one. Inasmuch as the dust is quite dense immediately around the flyer, Ralph's outlook is not as clear as it had been before. He can just see the stars, which seem enveloped in a haze. This, however, pleases him greatly, as he knows that his artificial comet must look like a natural one from a great distance. In this he has not been mistaken. As he afterwards learns, the comet has been discovered simultaneously on Earth, Venus, and Mars the same day he has made it. It has been charted and named, and on account of its great brilliance and long tail, has been immediately termed the Great Comet of 2660. That Lysanor would see the comet, Ralph never doubted for a second. He headed for the comet space flyer exactly toward the point where it would collide with Mars at the end of 6 days. He figures that the Martians will be on the lookout, and as much as Ralph's careful search does not reveal another space flyer anywhere near him, he knows that the Martian officials will surely locate and attempt to communicate with Lysanor. In this he is not mistaken. His chronometer points to 5 p.m. When he first records weak signals coming from Mars, several messages are exchanged between the Martians and Lysanor. Lysanor gives his number and position in the heavens, and he in turn receives instructions to approach as near to the comet's head as feasible in order to change its course. He is also instructed to bombard the comet's nucleus with time-set torpedoes if he cannot deviate the comet from its course. Lysanor's answer is that he will follow instructions as far as his equipment allows. During the next few days, Ralph is relieved to note that the distance between him and Lysanor diminishes with great rapidity. His trick has worked. Lysanor is rushing at top speed toward Ralph's flyer, firmly believing it a comet. Confident of success, sure of victory, Ralph is jubilant. Hope, so long deferred, floods his spirit. He whistles cheerily at his work. Is it not every minute bringing him closer to his sweetheart Alice? Is not every second drawing nearer to the moment where he will hold her in his arms? At last the Martian comes into range. Lysanor approaches the comet up to about 150 kilometers and then recedes. He then takes observations, but somehow or other the comet, instead of being deflected, commences to pursue him. This is opposed to all astronomical knowledge and reasoning, and Lysanor, fearing collision with the comet, begins to fire explosive torpedoes into its nucleus. As the distance between it and his machine is only 100 kilometers, he can watch the torpedo in its flight. Through his telescope, he can see the torpedo rushing towards the comet's tail. But the comet dodges, and the torpedo shoots far above the nucleus. It is uncanny. His aim has been accurate. He could have sworn. The distance is short, yet he has missed. The comet has moved out of the projectile's path. He has fired again with equal accuracy. The torpedo will surely strike now, but the comet this time sidesteps, as it were, and the torpedo speeds on through space, missing its target by a wide margin. Lysanor is bewildered. Fear grips him. Gravitational action has not made the comet act in this strange manner. He fires one torpedo after another, but the comet dodges them all. He suddenly stops firing torpedoes. He next tries to destroy the infernal comet by electricity. Soon his aerials are white hot with the energy he throws into them. He then turns his flyer into such a position as to direct the outflowing energy towards the comet's head. The only result is to increase the luminosity of the comet. Suddenly, Lysanor realizes that the comet is only 50 kilometers away. He notices with horror that the head of the comet now seems to fill up almost 1/4 of the sky. Another discovery that comes simultaneously is that instead of the comet's head being solid, there is a mysterious small black speck in the center of the nucleus. This is against both knowledge and theory of comets. When Ralph has brought his comet within 50 kilometers of Lysanor's, he feels that the time has come to throw off the mask. He has lured Lysanor to within striking distance. It is now time to strike. He has one great advantage over Lysanor. The latter is wholly unprepared. Ralph insulates himself by sitting on a tall glass tripod. He then attaches to his ears the telephone receivers that were connected with the induction balance, which he has attached to one of the glass portholes. He then starts to turn the glass wheel of the ultra generator connected to the outside aerials. A terrible screaming sound comes from the generator, and the whole flyer shakes. Ralph continues to turn the wheel quickly. The generator shrills higher and higher until the frequency has become so high that no sound can be heard. The vibrations have passed 35,000. Ralph turns the wheel a few more notches, and everything becomes pitch dark over a space of 60 kilometers in diameter. As in his Switzerland exploit 2 months before, Ralph's aerial on the space flyer, due to the powerful action of his ultra generator, attracts the ether so fast that it cannot be replenished quickly enough. It acts like an immense vacuum pump in the atmosphere. Darkness spreads over a large area as the inky fluid of the octopus blackens the sea. Both flyers become invisible to each other. Ralph, however, points his machine on its former course and speeds it up. Lysanor, dismayed by the unexpected darkness, has brought his machine to a dead stop. He is almost frantic with terror and stands like ore paralyzed, unable to think or to act. Within a few minutes, Ralph's induction balance causes his telephones to emit higher and higher notes, indicating, despite the pitch-black darkness, just how near he is to the other flyer. When he is certain that he has approached Lysanor's machine, he suddenly shuts off his ultra generator. Quick as lightning, he has grasped his radio perforator, and although the light, which returns instantly, blinds him for a few seconds, he has glimpsed Lysanor's terrified face just a few meters distance, his forehead pressed tight against the glass plate of the porthole. Ralph takes quick aim and presses the trigger. There is a silent flash, and Lysanor seems to topple over. Simultaneously, the glass of the porthole turns green. In a flash, Ralph jumps up and peers anxiously out one porthole, then another, hoping to catch sight of Alice. There is nobody to be seen. He rushes to the wireless and signals frantically for several minutes. Breathlessly, clasps the receivers to his ears. There is no answer, no sound, nothing. With sinking heart, he rushes to the connecting tube. In his excitement, it takes him 20 minutes to make the connection between the two machines and the tube airtight. Before crawling into the connecting tube, he grabs up his radio perforator as a precaution. The sight that presents itself to him as he crawls into Lysanor's machine draws him into an involuntary agonized cry. Lysanor's dead body, lay across that of Alice, his sharp dagger sunk into the upper part of her arm. Ralph hurriedly moved the rigid body aside. There lay Alice, in a terrible pool of her own blood, her eyes closed, dead. End of chapter 14.